Thank you. Thanks. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Really excited to be here. Like my colleagues, I will be concise. I've found that there was one thing even more effective than all of the emails I got from Andrew saying keep this to 18 minutes. And that one thing was a sobering conversation I had with recently with my 7-year-old son. And I want to leave aside for a moment the improbability of me having a 7-year-old son, which didn't seem improbable to me, actually. But thanks to Facebook, as you do with Facebook, I got a message from somebody I went to high school with 30 years ago. And she said, I saw your Facebook picture, which was me and my wife Rosemary and our son Nate. And she said, isn't it wonderful? I have a grandson too. But anyhow, the reason I'll be brief is Nate misbehaved for the first time with his babysitter. He's a really good kid. He's almost never misbehaved, but he misbehaved. And literally just last week, my wife called me up and called me at work, said, you need to come home early. We need to talk to Nate about his character and the choices he makes and his purpose on the planet. And my wife Rosemary is amazing. She's a little bit intense, you might have gathered. And so I left work early because he's 7 and I knew I couldn't wait another day. We had this conversation with him, the three of us sitting on the floor of our living room. It was a little bit of a monologue, and Rosemary did most of the monologuing. But afterwards, she had the very good sense to say to Nate, since he hadn't said a word, now, Nate, is there something in turn that you would like to say to us? And he just looked us dead in the eye and he said, thank you for your little presentation. So I try to wrap up before I evoke that in an audience. What I want to talk about today, and I think it applies somewhat from the lessons I've learned with our organization, but applies to probably many folks who are involved in social change and social innovation, is how we do this work more powerfully. And I want to talk about it in ways that I think relate to what I think of as the strategic necessity and the moral imperative of breaking the rules. I'm going to talk about a lot of pivot points to key off of what Andrew had talked about, in each case that had a dramatic effect on our ability at Share Our Strength to do our work in a very different way. The catalyst for Share Our Strength, which I started in 1984, was the Ethiopian famine, this very great human catastrophe. And at the time that we wanted to start an organization that would do something about that, we had no money to start it. We literally started Share Our Strength with a $2,000 cash advance on a credit card. Today, we've now raised and spent $360 million on behalf of hunger here in the United States and around the world. But at the time, that was what we did. And the one thing we knew was that we didn't want to just be a grant maker. We wanted to be a grant maker without being a re-granter. We didn't want to go to people and ask them for money so that we could give that money away. We thought that you just couldn't solve the social problems, whether it was hunger or famine, on the scale that they exist with this constrained system of depending on charitable dollars. I think there's a picture here of Alima, who's this young woman I met in Ethiopia. That'll be my only slide today. It's one of the key motivating factors in my work. We were at a school visiting, and I was standing off on the side, and I saw her look at me, and she turned and said something. I just saw her lips move, but I couldn't hear her, so I walked over to her, and I said, tell me, I'm sorry, what did you say? And she said, God bless you for coming here. And we ended up talking. She spoke flawless English. As you could tell, she's a beautiful girl, lives close to the school. This was at a place in Ethiopia called Project Mercy, where we were involved in building helping one of many organizations, helping to fund both the school and a hospital next to it. So I came back from this trip very motivated and very determined to think about how to do our work in different ways. And I want to talk about 4 in particular. And I think that the time at which we're having this conversation is so relevant. We have poverty in this country today at record levels. We have 46 million Americans on food stamps for the first time in the history of the United States. Half of them are children. We have 16.4 million poor kids in rich America. 22.5% of our children live below the poverty line. And so if we want to attack a problem like that, one of our first conclusions at Share Our Strength was that As important as the charitable instinct is, charity is not going to be enough. We're going to have to find some new ways to do this. So let me talk about 4 of them. The first was that we really didn't want to beg for money. We decided we would rather earn it. I don't know how many of you have ever applied for or written a grant. My guess is many. How many of you really enjoyed that process? Probably not as many. I always think of a New Yorker cartoon where a husband and wife are sitting in their living room in their easy chairs, and a puppy dog comes in and gets up on its hind legs, and the caption just reads, "Once again, I find myself in the rather awkward position of having to ask one of you for a biscuit." This is what life in the nonprofit sector can be like. And we got tired of being that puppy dog. So what we decided was that we were going to earn money. Instead of being an organization that redistributed wealth, we would see if we could be a nonprofit organization that actually created wealth. Make a long story short, we very methodically worked to organize the restaurant and the food service and the culinary industry. Chefs and restaurateurs who made their livelihoods from feeding people. We thought they would feel connected to the issue of hunger. We asked them to participate in food and wine events, to cook, to teach low-income families about nutrition education. We got to the point where today we have about 18,000 chefs and restaurateurs, mostly the top chefs and restaurateurs in this country, who were involved with us. And as a result, companies that market into the restaurant industry, whether it's American Express that wants the restaurants to accept their card, or Illy Cafe that wants them to have their espresso machine, or Evian water, or Domino sugar, they come and they sign marketing contracts now with Share Our Strength. Of the $360 million that I mentioned that we've generated and spent, about 2/3 of that comes from marketing contracts, not from the foundation sides of the companies. And so we're not competing with brother and sister organizations for those funds. There's no strings attached to them. Just to give you a quick sense of kind of the power of this, I'll give you one example. We work with a company called Calphalon Cookware. You're probably familiar with it, anodized aluminum pots and pans. And I met the president of Calphalon, and somebody suggested that we meet. His name was Dean Kasperzak. He'd inherited the CEO job from his dad. Terrific guy. We talked a lot about how the company was growing and all the things they were doing. But you could tell there was something about being the #1 pot and pan salesman in the country that was not kind of enough for him. He asked what we could do with Share Our Strength. They ended up licensing the name Taste of the Nation, which is the name of our food and wine event, and they put it on their 2-quart saute pan, and they called it the Taste of the Nation pan. And they said, $5 will go to, for everyone sold to Share Our Strength. And I thought, go knock yourself out. Why would anybody do that? What he understood is that we needed to have a contract in which we brought the best chefs and restaurateurs in every community into Macy's and Bloomingdale's and Dillard's and Bon Marché, and they would cook with that product and cooking demonstrations on Sunday morning, and the stores would reposition the product. And the long story short is that they ended up raising, through that mechanism, $360,000 for us. And we did a check presentation ceremony at their headquarters in Toledo with one of those big, silly, oversized checks. And he gave it to me, and as we were walking off stage, Dean said, "If we're giving you $360,000, can you imagine how much we made?" Well, that was the relationship that we want to have with all of our partners, because year after year, the partnership has been driven by them. And we realized that we really had this opportunity to create, not just, as I say, redistribute wealth, but create wealth. Not just fight for our share of that charitable pie, but to make that pie grow. For a nonprofit to be a tax status and not a management philosophy. So once we made that pivot from asking and begging for money to actually earning it, it opened up huge possibilities for us. The second rule that we had to break was that the rules say that you should be, if you work in this sector, you should be governed by and judged and assessed by what your overhead ratio is. We decided that we needed to be judged by the impact that we were having. Everybody wants to know what your administrative overhead. Ours turns out to be fairly low. It's ranged anywhere between 13% and 18%, and sometimes as high as 22 or 23. But basically, we've said that's not really relevant. Has anybody in the history of, do I have my iPhone with me? Anybody in the history of the iPhone ever gone into a store and said, "I'm interested in this, but I really need to know what your administrative overhead was"? No, it's never happened once. You buy it because it meets your needs. We decided we wanted to be judged on impact. And we pivoted from being an organization that feeds people to an organization that says we need to do more than feed people. We need to actually end childhood hunger. We need to, in the words of Jonathan Kozol, the writer and activist, we need to pick a battle that is big enough to matter but small enough to win. And we really drilled down on that, and we thought, well, what is that? And there's international hunger, and there's famine, and there's all types of need associated with poverty in this country. But when it came to children in this country who were hungry on a chronic basis, we thought that that was a solvable problem. And once we drew on a line in the sand and said, we're going to end childhood hunger, the politics around this were fascinating, because when we pulled together all of our colleagues in the anti-hunger community, and we had our fancy presentation, and we said, what do you think we can end childhood hunger by 2015? Of the 60 organizations in the room, at least 59 of them were against it. They thought, well, how much is it going to cost? And what if the economy changes? And what if you miss? And the subtext for me was that there was a deep, almost cultural discomfort with being accountable to a very specific outcome. When we met with our business partners, our corporate partners, or other stakeholders, and we said, here's our plan to end childhood hunger by a time certain, they all said some variation of, if you're telling me that there's a goal line and you know how far you are from it and what it takes to get across, we're in. We love that. Now, we eventually brought most of the anti-hunger community around, and candidate Obama in 2008, before he was president, embraced this idea and committed to ending childhood hunger by 2015, and that brought the rest of our colleagues around. So now it's seen as a doable thing, but there was this huge failure of imagination around, could you actually solve a problem, and could you be accountable in a very crowded and competitive marketplace? Could you hold yourself accountable to a specific social outcome? And when we did that, everything changed for us. 2.5 years ago at this time, we were a $13 million organization with 55 staff. This year, we've got 170 staff. We'll raise $43 million, $51 million next year. People had confidence in and were inspired by this notion of actually solving a problem, not just kind of solving it. The third kind of pivot for us really had to do with how we think about public policy. Social entrepreneurship, there's so much enthusiasm around the idea of social entrepreneurship. But I've come to think of social entrepreneurship without a robust public policy component as a little bit like a garage band without amps. It's cool and it's fun and everyone's having a great time, but nobody's going to hear it just even a few blocks away. Public policy is a critical component. And what we realized, the reason we thought there was such an opportunity to solve this problem in the United States was that we've got 21 million kids in this country. Here's one equation, and you'll see the problem and the opportunity in one fell swoop. 21 million kids in this country who get a free school lunch because of their low income. All 21 million eligible for free school breakfast. Only 9 million get it. And in the summertime when the schools are closed and kids are most vulnerable, only 3 million get it. But it's bought and paid for all 21 million. Entitlement programs that are so small and have so much bipartisan support from Democrats and Republicans, they've actually been exempt from the coming sequestration and automatic budget cuts. Now, why would there be this disconnect? There's this tremendous need, and there's this tremendous pot of money that's not being used. I've met with about a dozen governors over the last 12 months. Every conversation goes the same. Governor, your state ranks 43rd lowest out of 50 states in the percentage of kids who are eligible for these programs but actually involved. And the governor says, well, that's terrible, but what can be done about it? And I said, well, what I'm really here to tell you, ma'am or sir, is that you've left $150 million in Washington that could come into this state and buy bread from local bakers and milk from local dairy farmers. And every governor looks at their staff and says, is that possibly true? Why did we need this fellow from Washington to come tell us that? They find out that it is true, and they work with us to reduce these barriers. At lunch, kids are already there. At breakfast, you have to get them earlier. There's lots of ways to get around that. Breakfast in the first 10 minutes of the first period gets about 99% of the kids in their seats on time for the first time and gets them fed as well. So there's lots of ways around that. But the real issue here is that these kids are not only vulnerable, they are voiceless. Nobody's going into the governor's offices for them. They don't make PAC contributions. They don't belong to organizations. They don't have lobbyists. So we decided to be that voice, and we found out that Democrat and Republican, conservative and liberal governors wanted to do the right thing when they realized the problem existed and they had the resources available to solve them. So this public policy component became absolutely critical. And in a world where we're thinking about Sudan and Syria and Darfur and structural unemployment and gas prices over $4 and a lot of problems that some of us would have no idea how to solve, this is an eminently solvable problem. Fourth and final pivot, an example of the rules that we had to break, is the rules in the nonprofit sector that you should collaborate. You should work together. And we thought, yes, absolutely, of course. But the pivot we made is we also felt that we needed to learn to compete, that we needed to be competitive, not to put somebody else out of business. But I thought about this in the context of the only business experience I've had. I was on the board of the Timberland company, the boot and clothing company, for 10 years, and I found out that they made decisions in a very different way than most of the nonprofits that I'm involved with. First of all, when they made a decision, they actually made it on the basis of information. This was just a remarkable, innovation. Second thing was they were very intentionally and purposely organized and made sure the company was organized to outperform their peers. And they understood that to compete at any level, you had to compete at every level. So they didn't think of themselves as competing to sell us footwear or boots. They thought of themselves as competing to get the best people in fashion and footwear to come to Timberland and to stay there longer than their competitors do at Cole Haan or Nike or Reebok. They had this sense to compete at any level, you must compete at every level. In the nonprofit sector, we tend to have the opposite reflex. How can we do it cheap? How can we do it easy? How can we do it pro bono? How can we do it not with the best resources that have ever been invented, but with whatever leftover resources might come our way? And so we decided that we had to get competitive, and we made a lot of investments in our organization, short-term sacrifices in terms of the service we could provide so that we could have more long-term impact. I have such a sense of urgency about it, mostly because of this little girl, Alima. We stayed in touch for a number of years after I met her, sent me pictures of her high school graduation, sent me lots of just really sweet letters. And as we were working to finish this hospital there, I kept thinking of the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, who once said, in this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. That procrastination is the thief of time, and the tide in the affairs of men and women does not remain at flood, it ebbs. So every day as we were doing this work, before we'd made some of these pivots, it was going very slow. The change felt incremental and not transformational. And on one of our trips to Ethiopia that I couldn't go on, I asked my colleague Chuck Schofield, who'd worked with me for 15 years, to take this letter and give it to Alima. And Chuck and I talked 3 times a day wherever we are in the world, and 5, 10, 14 days went by before I heard from him. And I finally got an email saying, I hate like hell to tell you this, but Alima died from cerebral malaria. The hospital that we're trying to build and fund is not finished. They tried to get her to Addis Ababa 4 hours away, and they were too late. In the exact words that Dr. King used, they were too late. So we have to find, those of us who are passionate about social change and social innovation, we've got to find ways to break the rules. I believe it's a strategic necessity and a moral imperative, and we've got to find ways to do this work that has much more power to it. Leave you with the words of somebody who understood this, another great human rights and civil rights leader, Frederick Douglass, who once said that those who want freedom but deprecate agitation are like those who want crops without plowing up the ground, those who want rain without thunder and lightning, those who want the ocean without the awful roar of its waters. Power concedes nothing without demand. It never has, and it never will. So for you social innovators out there, don't be afraid to break the rules. Thanks for having me.